This is Wicked Problems. I am Richard Delavan. Last week, an explosion at a West London electricity substation led to the whole-day shutdown of Europe's busiest airport at Heathrow.
Authorities say a massive fire broke out at an electrical substation supplying the airport. The cause of the fire under investigation.
With homes and businesses without power. It could have been a lot worse. As Paul Domjan, founder of energy tech startup ENODA, told me earlier, we got lucky.
And we're very lucky at Heathrow that we didn't have cascading faults from that substation, and it could be as isolated, but that's not something the system does well. We need to change utilities and government's attitude to the system to think about, actually if we a more resilient system that delivers for consumers.
With attacks on energy and especially electricity infrastructure central to ceasefire negotiations happening today between Ukraine and Russia, attacks on undersea cables in the North Sea, and scattered Russian sabotage operations increasing in Europe, a lot of minds went straight to wondering if the explosion wasn't an accident. While the investigation hasn't pointed in that direction, it reminded some, including Paul, an energy security guy previously having worked with, amongst others, the American military, NATO, and a parliamentary committee, of an Irish Republican Army plot to do something similar nearly 30 years ago. The plan was set for the morning commute of the 22nd of July, 1996, with simultaneous attacks on 6 electrical substations around London, all carefully chosen for the best chance of leaving a huge chunk of Britain in the dark. Not just airports, traffic signals, railways, schools, hospitals, supermarkets. And coming just months after the IRA bombing in Canary Wharf and weeks after the bombing in the city centre of Manchester, if it had succeeded, it could have changed the course of history.
6 members of the IRA have each been jailed for 35 years for plotting to blow up London's electricity supply. Police have described them as 6 of the most dangerous criminals ever gathered together in one place.
We're going to knock out the power supply of the southeast of England. And there may have been other operations after that, but we were caught before we could do that.
They were well disciplined, they reconnoitred their targets, they made themselves very busy, they did a lot of anti-surveillance work, but they weren't as good as the team against them.
I described them at the time as the A-team.
But it was stopped just days before the attack by an MI5 operation called Operation Airlines.
The IRA devastated the centre of Manchester with a huge bomb in June. But the IRA campaign began to fall apart under familiar security pressures.
Slowly coming across towards the jetty.
A massive surveillance effort by the police and the intelligence agencies led to one breakthrough after another.
We're up the deck.
So far, there's no evidence that what happened last week at Heathrow was a conspiracy rather than cock-up. We're asking a 120-year-old technology created to solve very different problems for that newfangled thing called electricity, to now, where the grid's being asked to do a lot more. As friend of the show, Adam Bell of Stonehaven, said to BBC's Radio 4 PM over the weekend.
There is a big debate going on about how much we invest in the transmission network as part of the government's plan to deliver clean power by 2030. I think as part of that debate, we need to look again at the role of demand. So data centres, airports, big logistics hubs, but homes as well across the country who are buying new electrical kit. We need to make sure that we're not just building out pylons to connect wind farms in Scotland, to make sure that power can properly flow in a safe and secure way throughout the rest of the country too.
And, we're using heat pumps, EV charging is taking off. So, it does place more constraints on these substations, doesn't it?
It does, yes. This is why we should have really upgraded them over the last decade. But much like in water, we are bearing the consequences of underinvesting now.
Given how fragile the power system can be, how easy it is to knock it out of balance, what's amazing is that despite its vulnerability, people have successfully kept it going. So successful, in fact, that we've kind of taken it for granted. Later this week, we'll check in with Adam about that and plenty more. And in a moment, Paul Domjan of ENODA says why he thinks this incident at Heathrow, no matter what the cause, should be the impetus to make our electricity systems as resilient and flexible as the internet. It's self-designed from the beginning to survive a nuclear war. Now, we might not have to think about it in quite as apocalyptic terms, but to paraphrase the IRA, the disruption only needs to be lucky once, but the grid needs to be lucky always. And in an age of heightened threats, never mind the digital pressures of load, never mind climate change. That's not a thing we should necessarily assume is always going to be easy to do. First, let me just thank you if you've become a member at wickedproblems.earth. We really appreciate it. But if you have a moment and you'd like to get versions of this ad-free, these episodes, these conversations, plus our newsletter, plus other goodies, even if you signed up there with £1, $1, €1, it would just be a little signal that what we're doing is providing you some value, and we would love to be able to kind of take things from there. Here's my conversation with Paul. Paul Domjan, thanks for coming on.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me. I will see what's
ENODA is one of our favorite companies because we've had a couple of your folks on, and always delighted to get someone on from the company. So I'll ask you to explain ENODA in a moment to the audience, but we're talking today on Monday, the 24th of March, a couple of days after this major incident at Heathrow Airport. We're not going to get into the ins and outs of exactly what happened, other than the fact the airport closed, substation, there was a fire, something went wrong, homes and businesses, 150 people evacuated, and then and Europe's busiest airport shut down for 24 hours, basically, or near enough, which has shocked the political system and the infrastructure system here in the UK out of its slumber to have an urgent conversation that it wasn't really having before. So first of all, just let's take a step back. So Paul, you have a background that gave you a particular lens about how to look at this, which also led you to ENODA. So maybe can you give us a little bit of
So I started my career 25 years ago at Shell, building pipelines across Central Asia and selling LNG out of Sakhalin, and generally doing kind of what we called at the time above ground risk, kind of everything that happened after you got the oil out, or the natural gas, more often natural gas, out of the ground, and trying to open up the Soviet system. And then I got a call. I was in a hotel room in Kazakhstan in 2004, got a random call from Colonel so-and-so, and I thought, I must be in real trouble. But it turned out that he was calling because General Jones, who was the NATO commander at the time, had been at the Bilderberg Security Conference, and someone had explained to him that actually there was more oil and gas in his area of responsibility, Africa, Europe, and the former Soviet Union, than the Middle East. And he realized there was no one in the U.S. European Command or NATO hierarchy who knew about that, and would I come to NATO and write their first energy security strategy? So I came across to the U.S. European Command in Stuttgart in 2004, and really thought I was going to spend all of my time working on how we secured natural gas pipelines, oil pipelines, shipping infrastructure, et cetera. And then came to the UK for one of my first bilateral visits, and the guys told me about this amazing UK counterterrorism operation called Operation Airlines, which was targeted at, which foiled really at the last minute a really sophisticated plot by the Provisional IRA to blow up key HVMV, high voltage, medium voltage substations in London that would have taken out the electricity supply to London for maybe more than a year, and really derailed the British economy. And they had really done their work. They'd identified, which of these were the most critical junctions, which were the most likely to cause cascading failures, which had the longest lead time, most customized equipment. And it was only foiled because of because they took their operational security too seriously, and that led to them being spotted. But I really hope, Richard, that Guy Ritchie listens to your podcast. It'd be a great film. It's got Irish geezers, it's got crusty coppers trying to get along with modern CSIs, it's got hundreds of people surveilling them through the tube. There are still somewhere outside of London hundreds of kilos of Semtex that have never been found. The police searched more than 700 lockups and never found the Semtex. So it's quite a cool story. But Anyway,
Well, Guy, if you're listening, we are a couple. I can say reasonably confidently we're a couple of degrees away, but if he sneaks in the listenership occasionally, I wouldn't be totally shocked. So, but we'll make sure we get someone to just suggest he has a tune.
it would be a great movie. Anyway, so I left. So I spent 2 more years at NATO, wrote the U.S. military's first energy security strategy for Europe and Africa, and left really with 2 pieces of understanding. The first was really the only solution for allied energy security was a system based on renewables, because we just don't have, even leaving climate aside, which I know is sacrilegious to say today, but I think it's quite relevant in the Trump era. Even climate aside, we don't have the resources to build a secure system. And even countries like the United States that can be resource independent are still dependent on global market prices. So if you really want physical and economic energy security, you need renewables. But the other piece of it, and Operation Airlines really showed this, is that actually the electricity system that Nikola Tesla and William Stanley and George Westinghouse built for us is incredibly vulnerable, because Tesla's brilliance was understanding that you could operate in very narrow parameters to make the AC system efficient, because you had these big spinning power stations. But as the system grew, that meant that there were more and more dependencies and more aspects of the grid that aren't well appreciated. And actually, if you lose part of the grid or a key junction, those very narrow operating parameters, plus or minus 1% on frequency, are quickly violated. So in my home state of Texas, during Winter Storm Uri, we violated the bottom frequency boundary. The frequency fell by less than 0.5% below the boundary for 9.5 minutes. And that led to hundreds of deaths and $220 billion of damage. So the system is incredibly fragile. And then if you move to renewables, it just becomes more so, because in the Tesla AC system, the spinning power station at the top of the network adjusts its output to balance the load in real time. So we can't store electricity, we consume it as we generate it. But renewables don't do that. So Tesla's brilliance was such that he had the power station do 2 jobs: produce power and stabilize the system. And it did the second job so well that we didn't pay it for it, and nobody noticed until we built renewables. So ENODA's mission, and really the mission that I've been on since leaving NATO and realizing this problem, is trying to find a way to enable the grid to decouple those 2, so we can have renewables produce ample, cheap, secure domestic power, and we can stabilize the grid in another way. And what we've developed at ENODA is a technology stack that enables the grid to stabilize itself, and critically for the Heathrow disaster, become much more flexible. So we're trying to enable the grid to operate in its existing boundaries in a decarbonized, affordable fashion, but also extending those boundaries. And we see with Heathrow, we see with rising climate change, we see with Russian connected attacks on European energy infrastructure all over the continent, that we need a much more flexible grid, because actually the ability to operate that very precise Tesla Westinghouse AC grid is no longer there.
And I suppose it's, again, we've gotten lucky, which I think, harking back to an IRA phrase, I guess we've been lucky every time. They only have to be lucky once. And it's something that, before I forget, actually, because I think I got this out, you referenced in your post that this story does turn up in the official history of MI5. So those of you at home who have this on your shelf, you can go get out that chapter on Operation Airlines and find out more about that from the 90s. But I think, for me, one of the things that's always struck me about that fragility, right, in the power system, is that you and I are speaking now on a product of Cold War thinking about how to make redundancy and resiliency in communication systems and information systems that would allow, some form of communication to survive a nuclear exchange. So DARPA comes up with some of that. You can tell me how much of that is myth and how much of that is true. But anyway, it's like that's always I was taught. And so, we didn't really design the power system in a similar way. And here we are having this, this sprawling. I think Hal Hodson, The Economist, I think by quoting someone else, said, it's the biggest, most complicated machine ever built. The miracle is that it works as well as it does, as you say. Stuck together with sticky tape and plaster and whatever else. So, isn't the challenge, particularly now that we see this rising up the agenda as a security issue, right? This is front and center in the negotiations happening in Riyadh today. We're talking to the Russians between how do you get them to stop targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure? The Russians are talking about it because Ukraine has been successful in targeting their energy infrastructure in terms of oil refineries, et cetera. So it's a key part of the security conversation, it seems, in more salient ways than it ever has been before. And yet, how do we go from, we can't just shut it all down and build it from scratch, right? So how do we get from where we are now to this more resilient, redundant, kind of system, flexible system, where which is what you're building for, the world you're hoping to build?
let me look at the short term and then the long term. So we kind of fit into both of those, but I'll leave us out of it at first because I think it's important to just lay the land. The first and most important thing is electricity is so ubiquitous that we take it for granted. Think about Heathrow as an example, right? Heathrow has actually one of the most sophisticated private pipeline systems in the world to deliver jet fuel. It has 3 grid connections. Apparently, maybe they did, maybe they don't, but I doubt they exercise those grid connections in the way they exercise that pipeline system. So my understanding is, and we don't need to go into the details because we don't know yet what's happened, but that part of the challenge was that they just hadn't utilized these resources in the way that they needed to. So part of it.
And just on that, because again, I know that you're going to comment on this too much, but I want to just put in there that this morning, Willie Walsh, the former chief exec at Aer Lingus, et cetera, which is where I would have known him back in the day in Ireland, and now he's the head of the kind of Airport Trade Association. It's kind of remarkable for him to come out this morning and say, well, clearly, presumably one of his members, Heathrow, failed to practice switching over to one of these other points of connection, that could have been done. And so that just, that's part of the evolving narrative as we see that. So just to inject that context as we're
Thank
talking.
you. That's perfect. So, let's think about that, right? If you think about something as being vulnerable, you build redundancy, you think about using your systems differently, you practice. To take a couple more examples, one of the first pan-European pipeline systems wasn't actually the Russian transportation system, it was the NATO pipeline system, which was designed to be able to bring fuel to the front. To fight the Russians in fuel tanks. And it still operates today. And there's a whole team in Brussels who are responsible for the NATO pipeline system. If we look at Afghanistan, huge numbers of lives were lost basically protecting fuel convoys, which are incredibly vulnerable. So, we think about petroleum products as a vulnerability. We don't think about electricity. So, we have a strategic petroleum reserve in the United States. There are strategic reserves around the world. The IEA does coordinated test releases, like we know how to operate that system. That's despite the fact that actually oil's maybe the most flexible of our energy systems. We can store it. We don't need it instant by instant. Gas is the oil in your car. If it still takes petroleum, probably you may have left the field 6 months ago. The natural gas in your cooker, if it still uses natural gas, if it comes through a pipeline, maybe it may have left the field 3 days ago. The electricity you use is generated instantaneously. So ironically, the system that requires the most precise balancing and operation is the one we take for granted the most and exercise on the least. So, there's a short-term mindset change. The second piece, kind of bridging into the medium term, is historically we've thought about reliability as equaling conservatism. So, as a utility, right. And because we took the system for granted, the real concern of regulators was to make sure that utilities didn't, gold plate everything and push down. So we have a situation where utilities are not inclined to or incentivized to innovate, and they're not inclined or incentivized to invest more than this minimum level that's designed to keep down prices. And, that was a good approach when we generated most of our power in thermal power stations, knew how the system worked, and more or less controlled our borders against terrorist activity. I find it remarkable that actually there are not that many examples of attacks on the energy and on electricity infrastructure. I mean, the really tragic examples, for example, in 2003, were the blackouts across Italy, and that was down to a tree strike. And you think a tree strike on a line can take off the entire, much of Central Europe. The U.S. Northeast in the same year. I think that was also a tree strike. The system is so fragile. It actually surprises me it isn't attacked more. Not that it isn't. And we're very lucky at Heathrow that we didn't have cascading faults from that substation, and it could be as isolated. But that's not something the system does well. So in the medium term, we need to change utilities and government's attitude to the system to think about actually if we continue to build more of what we've had in the past and as little of it as possible, we're not going to build a more resilient system that delivers for consumers. We're going to have an increasingly fragile system that really impedes our economic growth because we can't facilitate load growth. And That's another example of the Heathrow case. That's one of the most overloaded substations in the UK because everyone wants a light industrial park or residential development or a data center in West London. And that is constraining growth. And then, the longer term then is, okay, if we're going to change what we deliver and change our change utilities incentives, change government's incentives to not just build a bigger grid, but build a better grid, and not just build just enough grid to get by, but actually see grid investment as something proactive that lets us support future economic growth and economic security. What do we need to build? And that's really the problem that we're solving at ENODA. And I'm very proud that we're deploying technology today into European grids to do this. But you need to meet a couple of criteria. So to your point, we can't. We're not going to tear it down and build it again. So it has to be backward compatible. If you think about the transition from fixed line telecoms to the wonderful packet-based system we use today, we didn't build the two in parallel and flip the switch. It happened bit by bit by bit. And I only got fiber to my home 2 years ago, but I was able to participate in that system from the beginning because it was done in a backward compatible way. The second thing is it has to have an impact from the first unit. We can't have a program where we say, we're going to change all the substations in Britain, and then we'll have a new, more flexible system. Each substation we change, in our case, each substation we replace with an ENODA prime exchanger, that needs to offer additional benefit, additional stability, additional renewable penetration in that location from the first device. And that's important because it helps you get a positive flywheel. And the same thing is true of telecoms, right? Every time you upgraded an exchange from an old fixed line exchange to a packet-based exchange, that improved the performance of that area of the network. And then the third criteria is you have to fit within the capital budget that's currently available, right? One of the biggest challenges of the energy transition is the cost of energy. And I think what we see in political opposition to the energy transition, whether it's in Europe or in the United States, is very legitimate concern about, what is the economic and human cost of a lack of energy availability. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we deliver this transition inside of our existing capital budget? Because the transition should push down the cost of energy, not drive it up. And if it drives up the cost of energy, there'll inevitably be a backlash. And remarkably, actually, it seems, and I don't have any data for this, but anecdotally, that our tolerance as a society for higher electricity prices is probably much lower than our tolerance for higher gas prices. Although we always thought that the sticker price of the price at the pump would drive real political change. It's a smaller part of our cost base. It doesn't impact economic growth in quite the same way. Whereas electricity really is the backbone of our society. And if we can't have affordable electricity, there will be really serious consequences.
I mean, it is something that occurs to me that and I've gotten criticism in the past for having this comparison maybe be a little bit too glib. So I'm not saying you're following me down that trap. But the comparison with, packet-based internet communication systems, versus what the fixed line, what came before the public switch network, et cetera, is that, I lived through that, right? I worked for BT in the 90s, and it was like, everybody who thought they were going to be a winner through that whole thing, whether they were laying dark fiber across oceans or they were gobbling up other big operators and, network operators and, or mobile operators, and everyone thought they were going to be the king. And no one turned out to be the king, except the guys who built the application layers on top of it later, as everything went from a metered cost down to practically zero. And the fact that, if I had to pay if I project the kind of bandwidth I was using today back to 1995 pricing, let's say, my phone bill by $10,000 a month, right? No one's going to pay that. But we're heading toward an energy system where there's going to be the same kind of carnage, because we're all living in these, each of us have our different paradigm. Thinking it's going to be like this. We'll just go this far in the change. So that's a bit of an unfair question, I guess. But what do you think? How should policymakers be navigating? When you have this recent example, or if you have this massive amount of obviously public good, we don't really think about our, maybe we do think about broadband bill if we're a certain, kind of income level, but most of us, tend to take it for granted in the same way we've taken electricity for granted. But the prices of electricity, like you say, are now putting limits on growth when it comes to industry, when it comes to housing, when it comes to all the things that are going to make an economy grow further. So it just feels like it's a tough balance. So I guess if you had any advice for Ed Miliband as he's looking at this week, and trying to wrangle all the cats once they figure out what actually happened, what to do now.
A few things. So before I answer that question, I love the analogy of packet-based networks. My very first job when I was still in high school was writing software in .com 1.0 for some of the first, web shopping applications. And, we used to say then we've got the web at one end and the browser at the other, and Alexander Graham Bell in the middle. And the electricity system today, the energy transition's at the same point, right? We've got utility scale solar and wind and the removal of spinning mass at one end. We've got rooftop solar and home batteries and EVs and electrification of heat and edge data centers at the other. And in between is Nikola Tesla, William Stanley, and George Westinghouse. And they didn't build this system to do this, just like Alexander Graham Bell didn't build the telephone system to support the web. So I think it's a very good analogy. And I think it reflects the point that you're making, that actually, yes, it's the application layer, but it's what delivered value wasn't pipes, it was platform. It was the ability to coordinate this new universe where you took an analog system into the digital world and there was a platform layer on top of it. And I think at a more fundamental level, this is, we see ourselves as a platform company, but there's far too much focus on the widget and not enough on, what is the systemic solution for the future? What does the future platform look like? So moving back to policy advice, there are a couple of things. I mean, I think at the highest level, Ed Miliband needs to understand that the challenge he faces today is not the challenge he faced as energy minister last time, right? The last time that he was leading that department, the challenge was how do we get EVs deployed? How do we build solar and wind? How do we get this decarbonization off the ground? How do we reduce the financial risks associated? Like, that problem's solved. We have no shortage of building solar and wind. We have a different problem. And that different problem is that the network is not supporting that transition. There's a separate issue of difficult to decarbonize. We'll come to in a second. But and it leads to, you were talking about the price of energy, but actually the real limiter in economic growth is the sheer inability to connect at all. We see that. Think about Northern Virginia. You can't permit a data center in Northern Virginia. You can't permit a data center in the Netherlands. I don't remember what.
And I understand the waiting time in West London is pretty bad.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is economic growth. That it's not even a question of can you afford the price. It just isn't happening because there is no capacity. We're looking at various industrial sites in the U.S. and that there's increasingly think of yes, if you bring your substation, it happens to be we manufacture substations. It's easier for us, but for your average investor, they don't have a substation to bring. So it's a fundamental limit on growth. It's not even a drag. So you need to think about the fact that the problem has shifted. The problem is now a systemic problem, not a how do we build renewables, how do we build EVs? And the solution to that problem has to do a couple of things. Number one, there's an important recognition, which I know it feels like another violation of the received wisdom. But there's often an assumption that we have the technology for the transition, and the reality is we don't. We have some of the technology, but we don't have all of it. And I think there was a McKinsey report a couple of years ago that showed that more than half of the technology we need for the transition is not yet commercially available, including for the grid. So we need to recognize that we need to recognize that innovation is a necessary component of delivering this. And that means we need to move from the previous way of thinking of the grid, which was extremely top-down, centrally planned, conservative policymakers making long-term choices, to a world where we adopt what we call technology agnostic policy. So instead of saying you need to install X number of transformers and X number of switches and this equipment, this specific equipment to avoid faults, et cetera, we're saying, to decarbonize this industrial site here, you need to install this type of hydrogen, whatever. We need to define these things functionally. So you need to install something that improves flexibility in the network. It meets these parameters. And one of the things that DARPA, I think, does very well is not ordering a widget, they order a solution. And in the electricity system, in the energy system, we often order a widget, and the widget ordering impedes our ability to innovate, and the solution ordering facilitates it. So that's one of the first changes that needs to happen. So I'll give you a very simple example. In the UK, we can deliver a lot more flexibility in the system by using the voltage levels of the network as a way of managing load, and that's part of how our solution works. In the UK, the ability to do that is regulated to specifically distribution utilities and was written with a particular type of technology in mind. And so that then locks out innovation because distribution utilities aren't really incentivized to do that, and that particular technology solution isn't the best one. Similarly, in the UK, we had in order to maintain system stability, there was a real push for how do we get as many batteries onto the system as possible. That's now led to an overbuild of batteries, but it's also led to a policy framework that really targeted how do we incentivize batteries as opposed to how do we incentivize flexibility. So you need to think about that longer term piece. And then I think that leads to the last point, which is, you need to encourage utilities to think about their business differently. So that can be regulatory allowances for innovation. It can be regular reviews to ensure that they're using the latest technology. It can be incorporating more than just economic value into the review process, but also incorporating things like security and stability and into the review process, a little bit like how we regulate banks. And that would lead to utility sector that starts to become more a partner in driving innovation rather than seeing innovation as a risk.
Well, Paul Domjan, I think we need to leave it there. Thank you so much for talking to us on this Monday morning. Fascinating stuff. We wish you guys the best. It's, I think, an important contribution to the conversation that needs to be had at this point. And I think, it's a solution rather than widgets, and thinking about systems rather than, how to just make more of, or even less, but cheaper of what we had before, I think is probably the way we need to be thinking about so many things at the moment. So I really appreciate you coming on and talking to us
Thank
today.
you very much, Richard. It's been a huge pleasure, and hopefully you can arrange to get that movie made for me of Operation Airlines. It'll be great.
Absolutely. And where can people keep in touch with you, Paul, to keep up with your writing? And
they can follow us on enodатech.com or follow me on LinkedIn. Those are probably the best places. And there's a lot unfolding in our story as we try to solve these problems over the next year.
Big thanks to Paul Domjan from ENODA for talking to us on an early Monday morning about the situation in Heathrow and what it might mean for the UK grid and beyond. And we'll be back later this week with other conversations, including one with Adam Bell from Stonehaven, where we'll also touch on this issue. And keep an eye out for the long-threatened, promised, whatever you want to call it, piece that I've been working on, which now ties in Ezra Klein's new book, Abundance, along with Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Canticle for Leibowitz, the culture novels, because everyone just seems surprised. When these folks have been actually telling us what they're going to be doing, really quite a long time. You just had to do the homework. Anyway, back soon.
This conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.